How many times have I told the story here about Baba and the atom bomb of spiritual energy? 3, 4 times? 5 times?
Last time you did, when you were here for God Speaks, I think.
Last time.
Worth repeating.
Yeah.
I haven't heard it.
Never heard it.
Well, it's so important that, it's got to be repeated. In fact, I always warn people nowadays that every time I turn up for the rest of my life, they've got to put up with that story because I'm going to repeat it. It's that important to me. I think it's absolutely central. And as a matter of fact, there's another pretty important chapter that's been added to it. So we'll stick that on. And even those of you who heard it a year and a half ago, I think it was actually, you'll hear the new chapter. And then I'm going to do a second story which relates so fundamentally and directly to God Speaks that we've got to have that to put the proper frame around the picture. So I warn you, I'm going to do what I usually don't do, and that is just start off talking, and I'm going to talk, and I'm going to tell the story, and I'm going to remember it, and if you got any questions anywhere as we go along in it, why, just wave your hand and we'll stop and take a careful look at it, because they're that important. The first one I will foreshorten just a little bit, and that has to do with Baba's words. And back in the days when I was just finishing off a little 3 blue book edition, new edition of the discourses. I think you're pretty familiar with that. We used them as sort of a workhorse for 10, 20, 30 years before the wonderful Shariar edition came out. And it had come out, this particular little 3 blue books, because of the fact that I was visiting Baba and he was saying, what about this, what's going on with groups? And I was telling him all about the hippies that I was running into in San Francisco and the Haight-Ashbury district, And some of them came around knocking on the Sufi's door and wanted to know about Inayat Khan, a few things like that. And I was tremendously impressed with the questions they put, the honesty, the depth of it, the sincerity. And so when the next time I got back to India, Baba had meanwhile sent out I call them the 3 Musketeers from Boston. I don't think it's quite the right one, Alan Cohen and Rick Chapman and Robert Dreyfus, to go around to the colleges and try to get them off of LSD. So Baba was all primed for what I wanted to tell him about my contact with some of these dropouts and flower children in San Francisco. When we got more or less to the end of the conversation, he said, well, what do you suppose we do about it? And I said, well, Baba, I think, as a matter of fact, that the discourses are going to be their Bible. And he looked very interested about all of that. And then I thought, but Baba, actually, there's a little bit of a problem. That is that Deshmukh, who is a brilliant man and a wonderful command of the English language, still he has that habit, the Indian habit, of sort of inverting sentences in a way that you've got to uninvert it in order to be sure what he's saying. So that takes about 10% of my time. And I said, Bobby, you ought to get one of your fine lovers to do a little bit of work on sentence structure on this. And you may remember then, that was the first time that Baba did what then became so characteristic. He pointed his finger at me and said, you do it. So, that just kept happening. Baba is subject to habit patterns too. So, he started that habit pattern right then and there. At any rate, closer. I'm crooning into it now. I think I'm Bing Crosby or...
Not very common.
No, I just saw Perry this morning for the first time for donkey's years. He was on television. You didn't see it? Yeah. Anyway, there it was. I think it's his 100th anniversary or something like that, isn't it?
He left his body.
Oh, he was terrific. Really terrific. Anyway, to go on with Baba's words. So when Baba said, you've got to do it, and I went away and I worked on it and came back eventually. And I think it was about the second trip that I got back to India. Baba said, well, you're about ready for the publisher. And I said, I think so, Baba. I don't know, maybe I'd been up too long on the plane overnight because I wasn't at my most diplomatic and guarded, because usually I watch my words very carefully. But then something spurted out that I absolutely sunk me. I said, but I don't know what good it's going to do. Saying that to the avatar about the project, and he said, do this. He said, I don't know what good it's going to do. Of course, this was 6 to 8 months later, but it was still, a real slap. I just couldn't believe it. And Baba rears back in his chair and he says, he asked more, and I'm simply saying, well, Baba, there are many people who love you dearly. This is the absolute truth. But I wanted to emphasize that there was love even though I didn't know what good the new discourses were going to do. And they say that actually words and concepts, intellect, and all of these are blocks on the spiritual path. And exactly far from helping us along it, they actually put blocks up and hinder our progress. And so Baba then leaned back again and he said, Harry's translated, of course, they say these about Baba's words. He was shocked absolutely completely. And because, I was that far into the black mud puddle already, I decided just had to go on and be honest from that point. And I said, well, actually, Baba, some of the people who love you very, very deeply, some of your most devoted followers, once in a while, one of them will simply say, I have never read a single word that Baba has written. And they wouldn't say it, in a manner as if, well, Baba's stupid or anything like that. But just it was not their particular path. So Baba then immediately turned over to Arish and he began gesturing, and Arish was replying, I think in Gujarati. Usually if they were in a side conversation, Arish was doing the English part and I could judge what he and Baba were exchanging. But this was deep, deep secret stuff that was going on between the two of them. And after about 5-10 minutes, then Baba leans back, sort of relaxed again, and Arish, I could just see him scratching his head because this had been rather complicated. And he said, Don, I don't have exactly the way to express this that will capture what Baba is trying to get over to you. But as close as I can get to it, what Baba is saying is that each of his words that he prepares to give out to his devotees, he prepares to give out. This is not just, let's say, a casual conversation. It's something that is going out on some sort of an occasion, an address or a book or something of this sort. He gives it to the devotee, and then the devotee brings it back. Arish had described this and reminded me how Baba did it for these special words of Baba. Brings it back and Baba corrects it meticulously, word by word. Then Arish went into the part that Baba had never gone into before. And this was so fundamental and so exciting that I think this is one of the most important things Baba has passed on to us. Arish says, Baba says that when he does these words in this special manner, he does something like attaching something like an atom bomb of spiritual energy to each of his words. And Baba says that even if the devotee does not understand intellectually 2 words of what Baba has given out, still if they work with Baba's words, they will automatically absorb a certain amount of that spiritual energy that he has attached. And then he went on and said, and Baba wants you to know that this will be of the greatest importance to the devotee's spiritual ongoing. And then Baba interrupted him and did some more motion, and he, Arish translated, and Baba wants you to know that it is your responsibility to tell my devotees what Baba has told you now. So, when Baba points his finger at you, and after quite a lengthy explanation like that, you know that you've got orders from headquarters and you darn well better follow through on it. So that's why you've got to put up with this story, and I want to keep reminding you of it, because the further away that we get from the period when Baba was in the physical body, and he could point the finger and butter you up and chuck your cheek, and do all the lovely things we love to have Baba do when we were around. And also, and this is now the critical part that is coming, the Mandalay, whom Baba formed directly for so many years, and who carried on this magnificent work of, let's say, expressing the avatar's love for humanity. They're fast disappearing too. So we say to ourselves, all right, these two major, Baba, the asset, and the Mandali is a major asset, are fast disappearing. What happens then? Well, I don't want to go into all of the P's and Q's, but I think that what Baba told me so definitively on that particular date says that these special words given out by the avatar in the special manner for his devotees with the atom bomb of spiritual energy attached, which will be so important for our spiritual ongoing if we W-O-R-K. Dina, do you think I could put that any more underlined? Dina says no. That's enough emphasis on that. But Baba really on 2-3 occasions emphasized to me, and it was very clear, this is not something you just sort of toy around with. And it hits you like a bolt of lightning. That's all. Harry, what would you say there? This is very, very important, and so we have got to work in order to do what is necessary here. It isn't necessarily intellectual work, but there is a bit of wearing out of the seat of the pants in one way or another. And what we're going to take up today is what has now struck me empirically as being an enormously important part of that work. Now, Harry, would you jump in?
What's so interesting, Don, is when I would tell my story about how I came to Baba.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, well, what happened? First I read the Avatar, and then I read God Speaks. No one had told me about Baba. And the story that I tell people, which I hadn't heard your story before, was that after I read God Speaks, it was like an atom bomb going off in my head.
Bless your heart.
And I was saying that years and years and years before
You
I
heard
heard
mine.
you say the story. But that's from day one. I would tell my story. It was like an atom bomb going off in my head when I read God Speaks.
Yeah. So you knew the real McCoy even before you had Baba's keywords on it. Well, it is terribly important, but the new chapter that has come up on this has been that since we've been running around various parts of the world, we've had 7 major full weekend seminars on God Speaks, such as we had here in Los Angeles. Los Angeles was the 3rd one, and there have been 4 that continued on, the last one being at Avatar's Abode in Australia this last late fall. That was not originally planned, but it just seemed to be in the cards. But since then, and even early in the game, quite a number of people in small groups would form and really start doing some work with God Speaks consistently. And what happens, of course, is every once in a while, email comes in, or the phone rings, or I'm traveling somewhere and bump into somebody. But there have been a series of collecting stories about individual people's experiences of deliberately working with Baba's words. Primarily God Speaks. This is what seems to be front and center, and I think for good reason. And the thing that is extraordinarily interesting to me is when Baba told me that story of adding an atom bomb to his words, I assumed, because I studied physics and chemistry in the university, and so I know a little bit about an atom bomb, and I know an atom bomb is a great big wave of raw energy. I mean, it's colossal, but it is what I would call undifferentiated energy. It isn't particularly related to this. Maybe there are more neutrons, or there are more electrons, or more gamma rays here and there, but nevertheless it's raw energy. And I always assumed, just unconsciously, that what we did, if we worked with Baba's work, we got some of this raw energy, we took it into our apparatus, we got the machine running, and we used Baba's raw energy in our own individual fashion. So, to me, it had to be particularized, individualized by us in our own manner. But the thing that is really astonishing about these things that people tell me about their experience is 2 things. The first thing that they say is, 3 things. First of all, their experience would come totally illogically unrelated to what they were doing or what they had been reading in God Speaks. And it was an internal, sudden clarification. Just suddenly, all of these funny straws that had been stuck around in their nature, miscellaneously, hodgepodge, suddenly ordered. And things that had been very confusing or sometimes terribly distressing would suddenly take on a sense and a peace that they couldn't imagine where it came from. But then, immediately behind that was, they knew that this came from God's speech. This was their imbibing of some of Baba's spiritual energy. So each one of them, none of these people knew each other. They were all scattered around geographically, but they all mentioned the highly personal, individualized nature of what came to them from their work with God's speech. So that said something to me. And the other thing, the word that they used, each one, and it was fantastic. I got so I knew the key word, and I was so exhilarated. Not one of them said I was inspired. Not one of them said anything about being off in some sort of a fantastic cloud. They were exhilarated. And I must say, I've done enough things that I associate with intuition through my life to know exactly the meaning of that word. When I do something that I realize is done with the intuitive processes, all of a sudden they all fit together and it's new and it's creative. I always feel extremely exhilarated. So I would never say that I was inspired or that I heard voices talking or anything of the sort. Just exhilarated. So the individualized quality of that atom bomb of spiritualized energy is, I think, extremely important. And I would go on to speculate on the basis of that, but this is getting ahead of the story. But if this is true, this is hellishly important. Many of you deal with computers, and you know all about the process of coding messages and this and that sort of thing. And so you get out the right code, and the computer all of a sudden puts up on the screen the thing that you're aiming at. Is it possible that what the avatar has done has put not just raw energy, not just individualized energy, but coded to individual drop souls? He knows all the drop souls are going to be coming along and what their specific needs are. So has the avatar, for the next stage, he's no longer in the flesh personally. The mandali, trundled along also, I hope, to God realization, or sooner or later, or sooner better, and that the avatar's preparation that he has made, and a terribly important one, are these coded spiritual energy. When we tap into the big computer machine, we put in our code, out comes our own personal message from the avatar. Sounds a little bit too simple, doesn't it? But sometimes the avatar does extraordinary things in an extraordinary, simple, direct, straightforward manner. So think about that a little bit. I can see Adele over there smiling and smirking. She says, I get my individualized message every day. So there we go. So that's story number one. Anybody like to say anything about that? Most of that is repetition for a good many of you. But the individualized part, I think, is a new and an important development.
That's the part that's so beautiful. And that the Baba says one of the ways to him is this unique individuality and the supreme tolerance that can be gathered from that by recognizing it's so different for each one.
And this is what one always noted in meeting Baba. You are an individual, and he knows you, and you know that he knows every lump and bump on you. And he accepts them all. And we got some funny lumps around and some funny bumpy places in our nature. But you just know that they're all accepted by him. And he loves us. It's great, ain't it? Well, anyway, the other part of this has to do with something that used to bug me terribly, and that's the title for God Speaks. When I first heard the title and knew that one of my first responsibilities in relation to it would be not only editing a part of it, and you all know that the part that I wound up was the part that Baba dictated to Arish. Ivy Deuce took the supplement from Dr. Ghani because she said it was mostly Sufi tradition material, and she especially wanted to handle that herself. So that was the division of labor. But then my division of labor rapidly accumulated, going around and talking to publishers in the New York area especially, and it narrowed down to Don Mead and Phelps Platt, Lord Vaughn. And we got along in our negotiations. I remember sitting in New York, and we'd met each other several times. And then I knew that sooner or later we were going to have to tackle, is the title God Speaks acceptable to God Me? You know, it's a rather flamboyant title, isn't it? Not unusual. Did you ever think of writing a book and calling it God Speaks or The Devil Speaks or whatever? You know, it's got a lot of power right in a couple of words. But I was looking at it from the standpoint that I'm afraid these guys are going to be shocked and they won't want their organization associated with somebody who risks the connotation that I think I'm God. So this was it. So I approached it with considerable trepidation. And Phelps Platt was a Yale-educated and built publisher, and very correct and nice sense of humor. But with him was this lovely sort of rollicking chief editor, Lord Bond, who was a bird watcher. He would go out in the swamps of Long Island and watch birds. And this just sort of told me that he's a real human being. So I felt that if I got into real hot water with Phelps Platt, the straight-laced one, somewhere or another I might be able to lean on Lord Bond, and his bird watching would come through with something or another. This is intuition, you see. And you don't argue with your own intuition. So here we were, and so I said, well, finally, but now what about the title? Do you think there's any problem about using a title, God Speaks? Phelps Bond straightens up and looks very dignified, and he looks over at Bond, and Bond says, no, I think it's an attractive. I think that's going to bring people in, just the title itself. Oh, I heaved a deep sigh of relief and got over that particular hump. And I just can't tell you how relaxed I felt after that. And I always loved Bond even more after that. He was very much like Gustachi, incidentally, with his wonderful smile. But he spoke. Gustachi, as you know, didn't. Anyway, we got through that particular one, but always each time that we have approached a publisher, and we've been doing some of the foreign translations, we've had to cross over very carefully this question of the title. And the French one went along beautifully, but because they had just had sort of a massacre of what you would call a sect in this Swiss side of France, the publisher said, I like the title, but I don't think that we can have Mayor Baba's picture on the front, because that would be almost an insult to the things that have been going on at present. It would create too much criticism. So we got out Ronald Gailey's painting that Baba directed her to do, where this goes up sort of like a conical thing. It's a beautiful thing. And that's made quite an impression. But that was the most hot water that we've gotten into today. So this has gone on for me for 40, 50 years now. God Speaks as being a problematical title. That was my total connotation for it. And somewhere around, I think, 6, 8 months ago, one of my favorite times to have a real intuition is when I have to go to the bathroom at night around 3:30, go back to bed, and suddenly something hits me, or when I step out of the shower. That's the other favorite time. I think this was a stepping out of the shower intuition. And just suddenly, I said, my God, I wonder if we ought to take the choice of titles seriously. It never occurred to me, you know. I just always regarded it as being problematical to try to get this with a good publisher. And when it hit me, I thought, how come I never even thought of the fact that Baba may have chosen that title meaningfully, and that this is really God speaking? And of course, I've been through all of this business with Baba for donkey's years, that the avatar and all God-realized souls know themselves as God. I hadn't even put that particular thing to it, but I went way beyond that. And suddenly I saw myself as a little kid watching Cecil B. DeMille's motion picture, The Ten Commandments. And here was Moses, you know, up on this cliff, and here were all of the Jewish people down there worshiping the false god and all of the ruckus they were making at the time. And here he is up there on the cliff, and here's a sheer sheet of stone in front of him. And all of a sudden, God appears. He doesn't appear, but his presence is there. And he starts carving into the cliffside, and the molten stone is dripping down, the Ten Commandments. This is direct words of God. So that came to my mind. And then I remembered that there is the Muslim tradition that Muhammad said to his followers, in relation to the Quran, these are not my words. These are the words that were given to me by God. And the Muslims feel very deeply that this is the truth. They were not even the avatar, not even their great spiritual leader's words, but they were the direct dictation of God. And I know many, many people who are not Muslims who feel that this is almost certainly a second direct intercession of God in mystic literature. So what I was asking myself is, do we have here the third direct intercession of God? And is this what Baba, because you know Baba hides an awful lot of things from us until it's the right day to bring it out. So I said to myself, my God, is this what Baba is really saying? So I got real excited and I sent an email up to a couple of editors of Neti in London. And I said, I've been hit, really poleaxed over the head by something. And I'm going to send you an email. I'm going to write up, I hope it can be a lead article in Neti for the next issue, because I think it's that important. I wrote it up and laid this on the table as best as I could. And to my astonishment, the editors of Neti said, you know, we just always interpreted it, Baba's God, and so of course when he says God speaks, it's Baba giving the words, and it's Baba as God giving the words. But they realized I was saying, no, it's even a step beyond. This is one of those rare intercessions directly of God. And he's got his chairman of the board in creation. But once in a while, you know, the guy who's the principal stockholder, or the total stockholder, goes right around and he gets his message out. And it's rare, but it does happen. So we had that all set up. In fact, I came back from London and I had done the final formatting of that issue of Neti. We get to an interesting, this is a very human part of the story, and please don't tell any of the people involved in this what I said about them. But I got to get them right in this story in the proper scenario. So we've got quite a character who's involved here, Dick Duman. Some of you have met him in Denver over the period of time. And Dick is a law unto himself, and I love him dearly. And half of the time I want to hug him to death, and half of the time I want to give him a big, swift kick in the rear. So Dick has got both sides to his nature, you know, but he's a real individual. So when I get back, I have a letter from Dick Duman saying, well, Don, I understand. This is sounds like a side part of the story, but it gets woven in. He said, Don, I understand that at the God Speaks seminar that you did at Myrtle Beach, you said something about Mani and Baba spending 2 hours working over the dedication to God Speaks. Remember, we didn't take this up here in Los Angeles. It's one of the two pet peeves that many people have. The dedication to many people makes no sense logically. So I took it up in London, we took it up in Myrtle Beach, and Dick Duman comes and says, I understood that you said it took 2 hours for Baba and Mani to get Ivy Deuce's idea down into specific words, and that meant to you that there was some doubt as to whether those words got set down properly. Quite frankly, I don't think it makes sense logically, but I couldn't remember saying 2 hours. So Dick Duman goes on and says, I want a photocopy of the letter in which you read that Mani and Baba had been together for 2 hours. And I read this from Dick Duman. I had two reactions. First of all, my God, I know they didn't spend 2 hours, and I'm not a person, you know, I enjoy enthusiastically using words and building up situations with colorful words. But I've been taught to be honest. I had a Swedish mother, and she drilled it into me, and Baba insisted on a vow of absolute honesty. So what in the sun is this business? I couldn't have said 2 hours, you know, maybe an hour, maybe half an hour, something like that. But Dick said, I want a photocopy of that. And so I was just trying to figure out now how, because I just gotten back, I'd been traveling for weeks, had all sorts of messages and bills to pay and so on. I didn't want to get mixed up in trying to find this original letter, which by that time was in a locked file way out at Debbie Sanchez's house, about 50 miles away. Get out there and try to find it and so on and so on. So I was trying to figure out something that sounded polite, but which in essence kissed off Dick Dooman and got me out. You'll get it one of these days. And then once in a while, you know, when the old Stephen's ego was ramping along at a tremendous speed, a tiny little voice will come out sort of timidly, gets a little bit more sure of itself nowadays, thank goodness, and said, well, Don, if you just happen to remember, you're going to be out at Debbie's house for a group meeting 2 days from now. And even though Debbie's going to be the hostess, she's such a sweet gal that she'll go over and get that out of the file. And you remember you put it pretty close to the top of that file when you put it out there. So it won't take you too long. So get off your horse and, you know, get it and satisfy your old friend Dick Dooman. So I did that, and I was driving home. Claude was driving back over to the other part of the Côte d'Azur, and I was relaxing and reading this. Now, when May Heroux started asking people who had been in contact with Baba through the years if they would send things for the archives, I'd looked carefully through the papers. I had read this. Always when Monty was talking about editing God Speaks, she would send the original copy to Ivy Deuce, who's the senior editor, with carbon copy to Don, who was a little junior editor involved here. And I would read it through, and usually I was traveling for petroleum, and so when these exchanges got rather lengthy, you know, I'd put it in a special file, and I'd say, I'll read that a little bit later. And so some of these things, you know, 45 years later, I was reading really for the first time. And so when I got back to this letter, the first sheet I remember reading it, because the first side of it was just lovely and spot on, was what a wonderful job Don Stevens has done on the preface and the introduction to God Speaks. All of the Mandali loved it. We're going to read it to Baba. So that I read very carefully. See how our subconscious reads the song. And then I turned over to the other side, and there was a little paragraph there, which I had just barely dipped into, which was what Monty was writing to Ivy Deuce, and she says, Ivy, Baba wants you to know that he liked your idea for a dedication. And we spent at least 10 minutes together trying to find the proper words. And I'm not sure if I got it completely right, but Baba liked it, and it's going to go in facing the contents page. And so, you see, when I read that, when I was driving home from Debbie's place and I saw that, I thought to myself, my God, 10 minutes. And so I sent an email out to Rich and Kathy Bloom, Rich and Laurie Bloom, because Rich had taken this video cassette. And I said, Laurie, I know you're terribly busy, but would you drop everything and get out Rich's video cassette and save what I actually said, because I knew it was 10 minutes at that point. And she comes back with an email 2-3 days later and said, you actually did save 2 hours. So the first lesson in all of this is, you know, you really do things unconsciously, and when you wake up to what you've done, you're absolutely, if you're like me, you're flabbergasted what you managed to do. So here I was in the car reading as I was going home, and I realized as I read this top little paragraph that I'd never read the rest of the letter. Now the rest of the letter didn't have anything to do with where I was hot on the griddle and with my own conscience primarily. But I realized that I had never even skimmed, even when I was looking through it for Meru, the longer paragraph that next came, and then 2 or 3 little paragraphs at the end. So I thought, well, at least this time I'd better do my homework. So I started the long paragraph, and the first 5 or 6 words told me why I had never even skimmed that one, because it starts out with, and Ivy, Baba wants you to know that your idea of auctioning your Baroque pearl necklace is a wonderful idea for the finding of the finances to get the book out through Dodd Mead. And this business of Ivy's Baroque pearl, never tell Ivy that I told this story. I mean, when you get to the right place, you don't tell her. Be careful, edit your words. Because when she came back from that particular trip, I knew her in petroleum before I knew her as a Baba follower, you see. And she told me about finding these Baroque pearls. I couldn't care less about pearls and still less about Baroque pearls. But every time I'd be around her socially, she was doing this with it. It was being strung here. She was wearing it there, you know. And then along comes Baba, and she starts thinking, well, maybe I should sell my pearl necklace to finance an important project for Baba. So the first time she said, I'm going to sell it, I thought, well, that'll be the end of that. Good riddance, you know. And then eventually she told me, well, it didn't work out. And then a second project for Baba came along, and Ivy again thought, this is the time now I'm really going to sell or auction off my pearl necklace. And again it fell through, you know. And then the third time it fell through. And about the fourth time it comes up, you know, every time the word pearl would crop up, I would just turn off. You know, down comes the Iron Curtain, and I wouldn't listen to another word. So when I came to this letter, you know, and the first 4 words are again bringing up Ivy's pearl necklace in the auction, you know. You can see why I skipped a great big long paragraph. I'd established a habit pattern. But I forced myself to read through. And just after that, Baba says, now before you auction it, there are several devotees who are very, very fine collectors of lovely jewelry. And you might ask so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so if they're interested in buying your pearl necklace. Don't even bother to auction it in that case. And then Baba continues this long sentence, and he says, this book must have the finest publisher and given the finest dissemination possible. As in the future, when humanity realizes the extraordinary importance and value of what is said here, they will recognize that these words are direct from God. Well, you know, I've had an intuition. I don't think it was 10 days before it made a trip up to London, just come back from putting it to bed. And here is a letter that has been buried in my files for over 40 years. And at this moment, it comes to light and gives Baba's confirmation in a fashion that I recognize. Baba was not talking poetically in this fashion. I know the manner in which Baba uses words, and that we're all God and so on. But when he says that they came direct from God, this was Baba's statement to me. Yes, Don, your intuition was absolutely dead right. So I rush home and I send off emails to the editors and I say, hold the press. And I said, I'm going to send a second article on this up to you. Now let's publish them both so the people will see the full story of this. To me, it was one of the most extraordinary examples of timing, the manner in which Baba sees so far in the head and so far before the event puts the necessary things in the right place, so at the right time. And all of this improbable scenario of 10 minutes and 2 hours to get old Stevens off of his posterior and finally read this paragraph at the critical moment. Now, right now. Because by that time, I saw that Baba was doing something with God's speech that said to me, this work, which has been under wraps, under the veil, if you can use the avatar's term for us, for so long, for some reason or another, Baba is bringing that out now. I began to put 2 and 2 together and see, it has to be at this time when even the Mandali, that enormous resource, and now Baba is putting into line another tremendous resource that he has prepared that far in advance, and it's up to us to use the thing properly. So that's the other part that relates directly to God speaks, but it also relates to intuition. So now we're all set. I've done the 2 stories. How much time have we taken? Half of the morning? Not quite. Divinity is a little news sheet that's put out in London. It's put out mostly by the English group. There are 2 or 3 people in France who are deeply involved. It is supposed to be an effort to report Meher Baba happenings and events and meetings all around the world, and not especially about a particular group. I can't say that Neti does the beautiful job that dear Dinah Snow does here for you in Los Angeles, because I think that's the pearl of all pearls. But perhaps Neti may be a bit more philosophical, even though, and it deeply, deeply carefully follows what's going on, especially with God Speaks. It has a God Speaks page, and the experiences of different people who are busy working with God Speaks, and now with intuition. My own experiences were that I realized very rapidly that the most exciting things that have been happening to me in relation to God Speaks were happening by an intuitive process. And the intuition started coming so fast and furious when these God Speaks seminars started happening that I got really quite excited about it. And I got in touch with 2 or 3 people here or there. One of them was a friend that I had met in Atlanta on a recent visit by the name of Neil Lundgren. And a number of you have seen a couple of things that Neil has written, principally for the Globe. So Neil was a monk in the Catholic order, and after, I guess, 7 years, said, well, nothing's happening to me, and left it. And shortly afterwards, ran across Meher Baba, and he had always known for quite some years, a very close companion, who is Tom Hickey, sitting next to me here. Tom has done his homework in mysticism, religion, and philosophy. I guess he's got more degrees in those 3 subjects than anybody I ever ran into. But the amazing thing about Tom is, despite all of this academic background that he prepared himself in, he happens to be a terrific human being, which is great. See? So he's got the best of both sides of the track. So at any rate, several of us got together, and Tom was rapidly right in the center of the thing, and we all decided that we'd just have to sit down from about 3-4 corners of the world. 2 or 3 of us came from Europe, Robert Dreyfus from the West Coast, people from New England, and so on. And so it was quite a representative group. We sat down for 3 solid days, and we just tossed at each other basic things in relation to intuition. What is it? What are its resources? So on. It was a wonderful time, and out of that we came to the conclusion that Baba's gift to humanity, Baba's avatar gift to humanity of intuition was undoubtedly keyed principally to God Speaks. And that to get somewhere with God Speaks, you've just got to dust off this avatar gift and start using it seriously. So this is the name of the game, and this is what we've been trying terribly hard to do. I think I couldn't do anything better to introduce our conversation back and forth on intuition now, and just ask Tom to give you a bird's eye view of what went on in Atlanta. Maybe some other things that Tom might like to toss in intuitively.
The session we had in Atlanta was...
I think he wants the mic on crooner fashion.
Thank you.
I don't think he watches his television, does he? He hasn't seen a good crooner croon. You know, they chew it. All right.
The group that met in Atlanta was composed of about 8 people that were handpicked by Don for unknown reasons, intuitively, I guess.
I had my hand in it, but 1 or 2 other people had their hands in it, just to be sure the record is straight.
And we came from a variety of backgrounds, some men, some women, some from 60s and 70s coming to Baba, some from very recently coming to Baba. So it was a very cross-section group of people.
Can I interrupt? Would you tell him when you came to Baba?
I came to Baba in about 1995, late in 95. I related the story in the Globe about a year and a half. Some of you may have read that story. Neil, who was a participant in the seminar, came shortly after me. I was the one who introduced Baba to Neil. And then Gary Miller was another participant, and he was introduced then by Neil. So we were all relatively new, and of course Robert Dreyfus, Marge, Sukov were older, and of course Debbie from Europe, and Don, certainly one of the originals. So we had people with a variety of ways of seeing, because some of us probably knew a little bit more about intuition from the historical, philosophical kind of perspective. Neil and I have academic backgrounds in that area. And then we had several women to represent women's intuition, and they had some very interesting things to say from that particular
They
perspective.
blew the lid off the pot, they did.
But I think that the essence of it was Don's contribution to the emphasis of honesty. And one thing that he hasn't mentioned yet, which has also turned out to be very, very important in his experience, and it was also very important in my own experience and the experience of several other people in the seminar over the years, and in talking with each other, we realized we were really on the same page through this serendipity of common experience, that the getting together and sharing honestly and transparently with friends the pursuit of truth is a great catalyst in tapping into intuition.
That's a word in inner links. You ever heard that before? Inner links.
And so what we saw was a process which was, as Don said, very personal, and yet at the same time it was interpersonal. And we felt that in getting together and pursuing this truth, that this group was a paradigm kind of group. We were exploring something for a reason that we had discussed before we got together. This wasn't, we just weren't doing this for ourselves, but it seemed that Baba has said that his gift to humanity in this advent would be the development of intuition. And Don has already related that he had had the experience, and several other people have also in their own lives had the experience of intuition dawning as a result of being familiar with Baba as the companion. Many of us feel, that we do receive intuitive knowledge directly from Baba in our lives. But certainly in working with his words, we've all had that experience also. And so in coming together, we thought we're not just doing this for ourselves, but this investigation has a much wider impact. And if we could come up with certain fundamental principles, some things that we could all agree on, honestly, that we had found in our own lives, and having discussed it with many other people, we were discovering that other people were finding it too. This is something that could be made available to everyone. And it would go along very much with Baba's mission that he gave to Don to go and tell his devotees about working it with his special words. And of course, Don has been going out and doing God Speaks seminars in that regard. Now it seemed there was an added dimension to that we really needed an intuition seminar, which would inspire people not only to work personally with Baba's words, but to get together in groups, in companionship groups, based on inner links of attraction and devotion to truth and devotion to Baba, to take advantage of that other catalyst. And so, fundamentally, what we've been working on then and since then is what we might call an intuition primer, trying to establish some fundamental principles, both positive in the sense of things which contribute to and catalyze intuition. But intuition is one of those tricky kind of things. What does intuition mean? It means direct knowledge. It means beyond reason. It means beyond criteria. It means something which is self-evident. Well, we all know. we know where they put people. They get these kind of messages. They don't blend in with society too well. So there is a certain danger, to intuition. There should be some way of cross-checking, because, we probably have all even possibly been guilty of it ourselves, but may even know other people have said, well, God told me to do this, or Baba told me to do this, and one thinks, not quite so sure about that. And so this turned out to be something we also had to take a look at, and that seemed to be another advantage of working with a companionship group where honesty was the bottom line, where we could all be mirrors for each other, and we could all act as criteria for perhaps avoiding the danger that has not yet come, jumping to conclusions about one's own intuition too soon. So these are the things that we were working on, and we've kept up this work through email correspondence and going around and talking to different people. Different people have come forward and said, gee, I'm really interested in participating in that. So the momentum is gathering. And Don did a tour of the East in January, now a tour of the West, and I think that the next stage is for us to widen the circle and to make it available for contributions by everybody who's interested in pursuing this work. And let's see what happens.
Incidentally, you might tell them about the chapter in the primer of individual experiences. But we've invited all of the groups to send in any that individuals in the group had of a personal experience, a personal intuitive experience that delighted, exhilarated them first of all, and shook them up usually, and shook them down.
Yes.
State for me again, your objective is to develop like a handbook or a primer on how to tap into your own intuition?
Yes, I think we have to be careful here because, I don't think anybody's trying to teach anybody anything. I think what we're saying is what we need to do is to get together and share honestly our experiences and see where the commonalities are. Now, if we start with a very big group at first, it's just going to be too unwieldy. So we thought, well, probably what we need to do is to get the work off the ground by coming up with a guideline for further work. And I think we're approaching that stage now. And the next step would be for people who are interested to begin to pursue that. And one way they could pursue that would be relating their experience, because this would be part of that guidebook. So a primer is sort of fundamental principles. And these principles would be generalizations from people's experience. And then the generalizations would have to be related back to particulars, and those particulars would be the anecdotes that people would tell about their experiences, and that would be kind of an appendix that would tie the principles to reality.
Any of these that are offered from the various different groups are going to come into the editors of the God Speaks page of Neti. They will tackle it first of all and ask permission to use either in their original form or in a condensed form on the God Speaks page in Neti, then pass it on to the work group who are working on the primer. That's the mechanics of it. I think it's a great project myself, because it opens the door to everybody to participate right on the ground floor.
If I could say one more thing to answer that question, it has to do with intuition per se, just any individual working on intuition. And in that sense, we would look at the historical development of thinking about intuition. Some of the great thinkers like Bergson, for example, that have penetrated this. But also, it would be quite directed to working with Baba's special words and the mission, of course, that Baba gave to Don in that regard. So there would be two aspects to this. And one outcome we would see would be a more universal, open kind of thing that anybody could make use of, and then something which would be oriented toward the development of those companionship circles based on inner links among people who want to work with Baba's special words, particularly in God Speaks, and also part 2 of Listen Humanity. And that would be, somewhat of a dedicated focus.
Tom, could I toss out something? This is just sort of a brief, almost a cameo type of picture, the way it looks to me. And that is, I cannot imagine that a Baba devotee would leave Baba's special words, particularly God Speaks, unmined now. I think it's our responsibility for all of us really to take God Speaks seriously. And secondly, I cannot imagine really coming to grips with mining what Baba has put there without using deeply, carefully, intuition. And I cannot imagine using intuition without somewhere or another combining it into, let's say, inner links with several other people. Because I think the truing and the honesty principle comes out in working with people that you respect and you love and you're willing to exchange with. So that's just a simple little 2, 3, 4 step process that I think all fits together. And I think Baba has given us directly all of those keys, and they're important. It's up to us to use them properly.
That mentioned the basis of the internal links.
Well, you remember the last time I was here, I guess I shook things up a little bit by having us read out the last message on the alphabet board, where Baba brings up again and again and again, and so clearly, inner links and what the importance of those inner links are. And now I am saying to you, I feel it's not only important for effective group work to establish this and meet the challenge, but secondly, in order to go ahead with one's own spiritual development, using not only, but a very large principal investment in God Speaks itself. So to me, inner links and intuition relate directly to getting the value from God Speaks, which Baba put more time and energy on than any other single project that he did. Yeah.
Don, can you give us your definition of intuition in this context, please?
Well, you know what? That happens to be the first item on the agenda. So would you all be content if we plunge into getting on? As you know, when you had the agenda on God Speaks, I said, look, this is just some suggestions jotted down, and we're all together, and anytime that anything prods you in a different direction, let's junk the agenda, at least temporarily, and go on with what intuitively is coming up. So, although, let's say we will start what under the sun is intuition, I think it's a good point to start, because I'm going to ask you that. I'm not going to try to answer it. Still, the agenda is there, and I hope especially at lunchtime, maybe you might take a few minutes to read it over, see if we're getting anywhere, or if there's some awfully important things suggested that we really have to be sure to get over some way in the afternoon time together. So I'm going to ask Nancy Wall, who is a very intuitive gal whom I've known for a long time. What do you think intuition is, Nancy? She's got that beatific smile on her face.
Well, I think it's, my experience has been, it's imperceptible almost, knowledge or certainty that you are made aware of without any conscious awareness of the senses, using the senses. I'm sorry, this is really
No, you
falling
said,
short.
I think the most essential thing, Nancy, there doesn't seem to be a context of effort and logic involved. It doesn't seem to follow any logical or planned. It just suddenly happens, there it is.
It's just there.
That's what you just told me. I think this is the essence. You almost always, when one has a terrific intuition, it just splat, it's there. And 1 second before, you were probably miles off in another planet with your conscious thoughts. And then all of a sudden, this comes up. You don't know where the hell it came up from, and why it came up. Because there's not a logical procedure. You haven't been beating anything through.
It is a purity.
Purity. Yeah. You sense of purity. What about, I see another hand way over here in the corner. What would you say?
I was going to go more scientific.
You see, now we got the female and the male. Go ahead, let's have a
I would
scientific.
just say that truth, capital T truth, is just constantly resonating around us, and that intuition is...
How's it resonate around us? Let's pin you down since you're a scientist.
Okay.
You're supposed to be pinned down.
That the... I'll equate truth with God, and God being everywhere, so it's truth is everywhere.
All right, so you say, excuse me, I'm going to keep interrupting you, but I know you'll forgive me. You're saying then that an intuition, a valid intuition, is something that is originated in God. That's the source of it.
I was going to get there. I was going to get there, yeah.
You're going to get there. Well, I thought that was what you were saying to me, so I just thought I'd get you there a little faster.
Yeah, I was going to use like a tuning for a kind of metaphor, basically saying that with this note of truth resonating around us, that intuition is when, for some reason or another, our vessels, like wine glasses or tuning forks, just for a moment begin resonating, picking up that note, and we then contain some small subset of the great truth.
Would you speculate as to what sets that tuning fork to resonate?
Well,
Any idea what sets it off?
bottom line, yeah, that the truth wants us to have it.
So there is sort of a pressure.
Because we are the truth, so it's like, we aren't...
Now don't you get too glib with me, That's a famous punchline. We are the truth. But that's got an awful lot of
Well, what I
sins
mean is
involved.
that he and I are not we but one, so if I'm getting it, it's because he wants me to have it.
But actually, I thought you were going to give a pretty contrasting flavor to Nancy, but I think you and Nancy are pretty awful close together there. I think Nancy has suggested that there is a purity. Purity, real purity, we do link up with God. So both of you then, I think, would feel that intuition comes from a very, very trustworthy and pure source, and you link the word directly, immediately, God into that. Do all of you feel, what about you, Billy?
I was just thinking the tuning fork metaphor when you asked him what sets it to ringing, but
Yeah.
for a tuning fork to begin vibrating sympathetically, you have to hold it very carefully and make sure that there's nothing leaning up against it or that there's no corrupting influence around it.
Bless your heart, Billy.
Yeah, because
Notice what he says, no corrupting influence, nothing leaning on it. So we immediately got another caution. Billy says you got to be careful how you hold it. And this is, I think, let's say the immediate warning voice that comes up in many people's experience. Because I think everybody who is aware of the word intuition and links it into his own life simply said, well, sometimes I have intuitions that are terrific, and sometimes I have intuitions that turn out to be god-awful. So there is this very honest concept that pops up immediately that sometimes they work out great and sometimes they're just a mess.